Thank you for inviting me to speak with you this morning. I know today you'll be focusing on the theme of creating inclusive and sustainable economies. Of course, I'm not an economist or a sustainability expert. I am a 25-year-old Ugandan climate justice activist. But I know that an amazing array of sustainability experts and economists will be addressing you throughout the day. So what I want to share is what I know, what I have seen with my own eyes. In early September, I spent a few days with UNICEF in Turkana County, in the Horn of Africa, to meet with people who are suffering from the historic drought that is wreaking havoc on communities there. Turkana County and other parts of the Horn of Africa have suffered 4 consecutive failed rainy seasons. The drought is killing crops, there is no pasture for the livestock, and water sources are drying up everywhere. Forecasts suggest that the next rains are likely to fail too. The ongoing emergency in the Horn of Africa is depriving children of clean, fresh water, of food, of livelihoods, and access to life-saving health services. It is keeping them from the classroom and forcing their families to move. The climate crisis is not robbing them of their futures. It is robbing them of their present. It is robbing them of their very survival. Over those days, I spent time with people who have done literally nothing to create the climate crisis, but who are suffering its worst impacts. I spent time with moms who are desperately trying to keep their young ones alive, trying to find food and water to sustain their families' lives for another week, another day, another hour. I spent time with their children who are clinging to life. I am not going to try to talk about how best to create inclusive and sustainable economies. The array of experts that are gathered here today know all about that. But I do want to tell you about one of the people that I had the chance to meet while I was in Turkana County in the Horn of Africa. I met a young boy in hospital where the worst cases of severe acute malnutrition are referred and treated. It was devastating for me to see, especially when there are available solutions that can be put in place to stop children from suffering like this. Unfortunately, this child's family was not able to access the proper services in time for him to receive the treatment that he needed. By the time the sun set that evening, sadly, he had passed away. This is one story about how the climate crisis is affecting people all around the world, especially in the global south. This is the face of the climate crisis. The climate crisis is not some distant future threat. The climate crisis is already here. And one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the unfolding crisis is the injustice of it all. Africa is responsible for less than 4% of global emissions. The entire continent of Africa, 54 countries, just 4%. For perspective, the US is responsible for about 25% of global emissions. So while Africans, like that little boy in Turkana County, have played no part in creating this emergency, we are the ones bearing the brunt of the worst impacts. The African Development Bank states that Africa is the most vulnerable continent to climate change impacts. The World Health Organization announced recently that 1 in 3 people across Africa are facing water scarcity. The World Bank just announced that by 2050, 86 million Africans will be forced to leave their homes and try to find somewhere else to exist. And after years of failed rains, the World Food Programme says that 22 million people are at a risk of famine across the Horn of Africa. While the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events is now a global phenomenon, it is much harder for people in the poorer, more vulnerable countries of the global south to recover from these devastating droughts, storms, and floods. A few weeks ago, a group of scientists announced that we have likely already approached 5 disastrous tipping points. These include the collapse of Greenland's ice cap, eventually producing a huge sea level rise, the collapse of a key current in the North Atlantic, disrupting rain upon which billions of people depend for food, and an abrupt melting of carbon-rich permafrost. They went on to say that if we exceed the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold, we are likely to blow past 5 more climate tipping points. Most scientists believe we are already nearing 1.5 degrees Celsius. Keeping global temperature average below 1.5 degrees Celsius would require, among other things, an immediate and massive reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, recently announced that we can't have no new fossil fuels if we are to keep global temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has repeatedly said that any new investment in fossil fuels would be economic and moral madness. And yet, leaders from the global north countries who are responsible for the vast amount of emissions which are hitting our planet are breaking climate promises they made just months ago at the COP26 climate conference. Since we are in London,
Well, that was fun. We wanted to make sure you get your 10,000 steps in. But also, you can control emergencies, and this couldn't be really more fitting when talking about climate change. So I give you back Vanessa Nakate.
thank you all so much. It's interesting how we had a moment of threat and how we all quickly reacted to an emergency because there was a possibility of our house being on fire, but literally our house is on fire. The climate crisis is not some distant threat. It is already happening right now. Most scientists believe we are already nearing 1.3 degrees Celsius. Keeping global temperature average below 1.5 degrees Celsius would require, among other things, an immediate and massive reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, recently announced that we can have no new fossil fuels if we are to keep global temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has repeatedly said that any new investment in fossil fuels would be economic and moral madness. And yet, leaders from the global north countries who are responsible for the vast amount of emissions which are hitting our planet are breaking climate promises they made just months ago at the COP26 climate conference. Since we are in London, let's take the UK for example. The UK is still the COP president. Alok Sharma is traveling around the world to encourage countries to raise their levels of ambition on climate action. He's even asking global south countries to reduce their emissions. And yet, a few months ago, the UK government announced it would open up 100 new licenses of oil and gas in the North Sea. I want us to just stop here for a moment. The scientists are saying we are approaching catastrophic tipping points that threaten vast parts of the world's population. The World Authority on Energy is saying we cannot have any new oil and gas if we are to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius. That young boy in Turkana County and other 1.4 billion people who live in Africa who have done nothing to create this crisis are paying for this with their livelihoods and their lives. And yet the country that is leading the negotiations for climate action is calling for 100 new licenses of oil and gas in the North Sea and is hopelessly off track for its climate targets. Do you hear this? We face catastrophic tipping points, a clear signal that we must have no new oil and gas. People from poor countries are suffering and dying, and people from rich countries who have long benefited from fossil fuel extraction still feel they need more coal, oil, and gas, regardless of what that may mean for people who look like me. I am not an economist or a sustainability expert, but I am a human being, and I know this is clearly wrong. 12 years ago, at a United Nations Climate Summit in Copenhagen, rich nations made a significant pledge. They promised to channel $100 billion a year to less wealthy nations by 2020 to help them adapt to climate change and mitigate further rises in temperature. We are still waiting. And the climate finance that does make its way to poor countries often comes in the form not of grants, but in high interest loans. So in order for them to try to recover from climate catastrophes, poor countries that did the least to cause this crisis are having to take high interest loans from rich countries which have profited from years of fossil fuel extraction and burning. Does that sound right to you? Because it sounds wrong to me. Many global south countries are for the very first time having to consider exploring for fossil fuels just to help them pay off the interest on loans they need to help them try to recover from climate-induced storms, floods, and droughts. And now, European leaders are claiming they need Africa to develop new fossil fuel infrastructure to replace Russian energy amid the war in Ukraine, even though we know that new development would take many years to produce even a drop of new oil and gas. And on top of this, big oil and gas companies are pretending that we need new fossil fuel development in Africa to lift people out of energy poverty. It is true that energy poverty is still hurting millions of people in Africa and across the global south. In sub-Saharan Africa, around 600 million people still don't have basic access to electricity. But I want to be clear about this. Big oil and gas companies have been promising to lift people out of energy poverty for decades. It is a lie. It's always been a lie. The pipelines and power lines from coal, oil, and gas plants will never reach those who live at the last mile, and these corporations know this. The oil and gas that fossil fuel companies want to develop in Africa will not be for Africans. That oil and gas will be loaded onto ships and get shipped to Europe. And the profits from that new fossil fuel development will line the pockets of people who are already very rich. And when that new fossil fuel infrastructure has to become obsolete in the next couple of decades, the resulting debt will suffocate Africans who are already drowning in existing debt. The only way to help lift people out of energy poverty is through distributed renewable energy. That is the cheapest, fastest way to get energy to people living at the last mile. So please, let's put to bed this lie of fossil fuel being a bridge for Africa. If you want to call fossil fuels a bridge, then let's please be accurate. Fossil fuels are a bridge to nowhere, or maybe somewhere even worse. The climate crisis is here, and no one is safe. We saw that with the heat waves and fires that ravaged the UK this summer. So yes, we are all in the same storm, but we are in different boats. Poor communities, global south communities, communities of people who look like me, we are in very small boats, overcrowded boats. Boats with many holes, boats that could capsize easily. Again, I'm just a 25-year-old climate justice activist. I do not know how to create inclusive and sustainable economies, but I do know that we must put people and justice at the center of addressing the climate crisis. We must take care of people. We must take care of vulnerable communities. We must take care of the planet for the generations who are still to come. If we are not doing that, I don't know how we could consider ourselves inclusive or sustainable. So please put people and justice at the center of your conversations today, and please put people and justice at the center of the important work that you do when you leave this place. We cannot eat coal, we cannot drink oil, and we cannot breathe gas. Thank you.